In this video, we are going to evaluate limits at infinity with square roots. Now, we need to remember that a square root and a square will cancel each other out. So as our first step, we are going to pull out x squared as a common factor underneath the square root. So we have the limit as x approaches negative infinity, and under our square root, we're going to have x squared into, in our first term, we are left with 1. Now, when we pull out x squared from 4x, we are going to be left with 4 over x. So x squared times 1 gives us x squared times 4 over x will give us 4x. And we have minus 2x, and our denominator will stay as is. Now, as I mentioned, we are aware that the square root and the square will cancel each other out. And we should just be left with x, right? However, there is something that we need to bear in mind. At the moment, without referring to the limit itself, we are unsure as to whether this is going to be a positive x or a negative x. And to make sense of this, if we have a positive x times a positive x, that is going to give us x squared. But also, negative x times negative x gives us x squared as well. So how do we know whether we have positive x or negative x? Now, to represent this, once we allow the square root to cancel out the square, we are just going to use the absolute value of x. And just to remind you what absolute value is, an absolute value tells you that it could either be a positive x if our x values are greater than or equal to 0, or it could be a negative x if our x values are less than 0. Now, if the concept of an absolute value is new to you, I will be posting a video very soon covering the entire topic of absolute values with limits and with a few examples as well. So if you're not sure how to work with absolute values, if you're struggling with a section, or if you just need a refresher, please look out for that video. Once I've uploaded it, I will link it to this video for your convenience. So at the moment, once the square root and the square cancel each other out, we are going to have the absolute value of x. Under the square root, we're going to be left with 1 plus 4 over x minus 2x all over 2x. Now, once you have your absolute value, you need to decide, is this value of x going to be positive or negative? Now, based on your limit will tell you what your x values are. So our limit tells us that x is approaching negative infinity. So we understand that the x values are getting closer and closer to negative infinity. So when we replace this absolute value, we are going to replace it with negative x. So in this case, for limits at infinity with square roots, once you have your absolute value and you need to replace it with either positive x or negative x, the easiest way to know what to do is look at your limit itself. If it's negative infinity, replace it with negative x. If it's positive infinity, replace it with positive x. So to apply the absolute value to this question, you don't exactly need an in-depth understanding of absolute values. Your limit itself will help you to decide whether you use a positive or a negative. So we're going to rewrite this as negative x square root 1 plus 4 over x minus 2x all over 2x. Now at this point, we notice that our two terms in the numerator have something in common with each other. They both contain negative x. So as our next step, we can factorize. So in our numerator, let's pull out negative x as a common factor. From the first term, we're left with the square root, and from the second term, we are left with plus 2. And in the denominator, we have 2x. Now at this point, once you've factorized, you notice that we've got x in the numerator and denominator that are common, so they can cancel out with each other. So once you have factorized and simplified, you are now ready to make use of the limit. So you're more than welcome to rewrite what you have here, so just so that it's a bit more clear to you. But if you can work with it from here, then you're just going to substitute the limit. So we have negative into. It's going to be the square root of 1 plus. Now, when we substitute negative infinity in place of x, we have 4 over negative infinity. Now, remember from the previous videos that we can break this up as 4 times 1 over x, which is going to be 4 times 1 over infinity, and we know that 1 over infinity is equal to 0. So 4 times 0 is 0. So under our square root, we have 1 plus 0. We've got a plus 2 next to that, and our denominator is 2. Simplifying the numerator, we've got the square root of 1, which is 1, plus 2, that gives us 3. So we have negative 3. Remember, there was a negative in front of the bracket, and our denominator is 2. So our final answer for this question is negative 3 over 2. Now, let's just do a quick recap of the steps that we covered to answer example 1. Our first step was to pull out x squared as a common factor underneath the square root. Once the square root and the square cancel each other out, we are left with the absolute value of x. To decide whether x is going to be positive or negative x, we look at our limit. Since we had negative infinity, we know that x has to be negative. So we replaced x with negative. We replaced the absolute value of x with negative x. From there, we factorized, we simplified, and we substituted our limit, or we made use of the limit. Let's look at another example. So, for example 2, we now have the limit as x approaches, and now it is positive infinity. Our numerator is 4x plus 8. Denominator is the square root of x squared plus 7x. And next to that, we have minus 2x. Now, remember your first step is to pull out x squared as a common factor underneath the square root. So, underneath the square root, we are going to have x squared into 1 plus. Pulling out x squared from 7x, we will be left with 7 over x. And then minus 2x. Now the next step is to allow the square root and the square to cancel each other out. And we know that once we do that, we are going to be left with the absolute value of x. And underneath the square root, we are left with 1 plus 7 over x. Minus 2x. The next step is for us to decide whether we are going to use positive infinity, whether we are going to use positive x or negative x. Since x is now approaching positive infinity, we need to have positive x values. So in the denominator, we are going to replace the absolute value of x with positive x. The next step is for us to factorize. Factorizing the denominator, we notice that both terms have x, so let's pull out that x as a common factor. Also, what we can do here at the same time is for us to factorize the numerator as well. So I will actually do that in the next step. But if you're able to identify it at the moment and you want to factorize the numerator as well, you're more than welcome to. Now in our denominator, we are going to be left with the square root, and from the second term, we're left with minus 2. Now remember that once you factorize where you have the square root, you want whatever you factorized to cancel out with itself from the opposite part of the fraction, meaning that we've pulled out positive x as a common factor. We need it to cancel out with positive x as well from the numerator. So we can actually factorize our numerator and pull out x as a common factor. Factorizing x from 4x, we are going to be left with 4. Pulling out x from 8, we are going to be left with 8 over x. And our denominator is going to be the same as before, x into the root of 1 plus 7 over x minus 2. Now this is exactly what we want. We want the x's to cancel out with each other. At this point, we can now make use of the limit. So wherever we have x, we are going to substitute infinity. So we have 8 over x, that is 8 over infinity, which is equal to 0. In the denominator, under our square root, we have 1 plus. 7 over x is 7 over infinity, that's going to be 0, minus 2. Simplifying our numerator, we are left with 4. Simplifying the denominator, we've got the square root of 1, which is 1, and 1 minus 2 is going to be negative 1. 4 divided by negative 1 is negative 4 as our final answer. If you found this video beneficial, please make sure to subscribe and hit the like button and leave a comment below with any suggestions that you may have of topics that can be covered in the future.